It worked. It just tells me the meeting is being live streamed.
All right, maybe we were successful then. Lori, can you confirm if we're streaming right now? We are. Okay, great. Well, hello everybody. Welcome and sorry for the technical difficulties. Welcome back to 1,000 Conversations About Our Future Power Lunch series. This is a project of the Ithaca Green New Deal, as always, that aims to engage you in a conversation about the future of Ithaca. And as always, I am your lovely and charming host, Rebecca Evans, Sustainability Planner with the City of Ithaca. And also returning is Lariah, who will be managing our YouTube chat. So if you have any questions or comments, we encourage you to interact with us via the chat, and Lariah will be sure to funnel those questions to the speakers, and we'll do our best to respond to those. Today, we are talking about one of the most difficult things when we're talking about mitigating the climate crisis, and that's social change. So the human element of the Green New Deal, how do we convince people to make these kind of scary, sometimes expensive changes in their daily lives that will help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and ultimately create a better place for Ithacans to live. And joining us today, we have the lovely Ann Rhodes, energy educator at Cornell Cooperative Extension and full-time activist in the community and the anti-racism space, coordinator for Tompkins County Standing Up for Racial Justice, among many other anti-racist organizations. And Dr. Jason Hamilton, professor of environmental studies and sciences at Ithaca College, also a genius beekeeper, as I remember. And the three of us worked on a project at Ithaca College called Campus to Community that really examined how to make these changes and the importance of building relationships, town and gown relationships, but also community relationships. And those are some of the threads that we're going to pull on today. So you're also stuck with me as a guest today, in addition to your host. So good luck with that. But I want to welcome Ann and Jason. Welcome to our digital space. It's great to have you.
It's great to be here. I'm excited for this conversation.
And yeah, it feels strangely familiar because the three of us worked for so many months together on the webinar series. Maybe we should put in the chat, Rebecca, the link to the webinars so that if anybody wants to follow up, they can. But we did some great work, and I'm really glad to be together with you two again.
Also,
it's great to see you all.
Back like COVID flashbacks because during lockdown, right? So, yeah.
Oh yeah, it's been a long 2 years, that's for sure. And I think it's been almost exactly a year since we've all been together, I think. So yeah. It's nice to reconnect, especially over the same sort of work. Maybe we can take a second and just give each other quick updates on what we're working on and what we're excited about, maybe for either personal or professional this coming summer.
Go for it, Jason.
This summer, so I, for those of you who don't know me, I run the apiary at Ithaca College. And so, and right now is kind of peak bee season. So summer is always a really busy time, running the apiary, training new students on how to work in the apiary, establishing kind of outreach, education and campaigns to both the community of non-beekeepers as well as beekeepers, to connect with this as an educational resource. So that's a big chunk of my summer. Up at Ithaca College, because of kind of the COVID disruptions and various things, there's also a lot of curricular enhancement going on. And so environmental studies and sciences is in the process of pretty much completely overhauling all of our degree programs.
Wow.
And so that work started this semester, but that will continue through the summer in terms of, in this new post-COVID world, what should an environmental degree look like? All the way to like, what should it even be called? up to what classes should you take, how many credits should it be. The whole thing is on the table. And so that's been very engaging work.
I think that's really typical of what's going on everywhere. Is the climate crisis and COVID have caused everybody to rethink what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I see that in so many realms of people realize what we had to realize because of COVID, and also what we had to realize because of the murder of George Floyd, is causing us to just rethink how we do things. And it's causing a lot of disruption and change, and it's not necessarily comfortable, but it's pretty exciting because where we're headed is such a better place.
I agree. We're having some really difficult and wonderful conversations on race, equity, and inclusion. Both kind of in our department at the college, as well as in the whole field of environmental sciences, environmentalism, these sorts of things. Yep.
And for folks watching, the mention of systemic racism and the murder of George Floyd may come as a little bit of a shock as part of this conversation. So I want to dig a little bit deeper into that. Is why are we even mentioning that? You know, this was a really core element of our campus to community work, and you know, we don't talk a lot about that intersection. So you know, I'd love to hear kind of and from your activist perspective, how are you seeing those issues interconnect? And then Jason, with your conversations happening at Ithaca College, you know, what kind of discussion is there over incorporating those sorts of themes into general environmental science education? And in no particular order. I know I just threw a lot at both of you.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I have been working with for the last several years is recognizing that the way we got ourselves into these crises, the white supremacy crisis, the climate crisis, even the COVID crisis, the economic inequality, they all have the same root causes. And rethinking how to approach the climate crisis from the perspective of that it's the same root causes that cause the climate crisis, that cause white supremacy and racism in this country. And that's like a whole new sort of intellectual way of coming at the problem. I don't know how deep you want to get into this, but the ideas of hierarchy and patriarchy and greed and power hungry and, you know, scarcity mentality, and all of these things pertain to each of those crises, and they need to be addressed together. If we just technologically solve the climate crisis and we don't pay attention to climate justice, then we didn't actually fix anything.
I think, you know, another just to add on to what Anne was saying, kind of the sustainability framework that was laid down kind of, you know, back in the 80s, recognized that one of the problems with kind of the way humans were approaching things was by segmenting issues, and the way this was thought about was that if at the government level, there, whether you want to call it a ministry or a department or whatever, there's a ministry of finance, there's a ministry of, say, housing and urban development, there's a ministry, you know, so there's different departments, and so the recognition was that, you know, that's really the root of a lot of this problem, is that we have at the national level and all down and up, then we're trying to think about these things separately. And so even though sustainability was specifically designed to address that problem, it's very difficult to address problems in abstract, right? It's one thing to say, you know, we need to deal with the environment, and we need to deal with human health, and we need to deal with this and that. And people, of course, were trying to connect it. But I think what kind of happened kind of to us all at once is these things went from being abstract to absolutely individual cases. You know, COVID isn't just about saying we need to worry about kind of human health. There was a pandemic. The pandemic caused a huge economic upheaval. And so it wasn't just saying we're worried about the economy, we're worried about huge economic upheaval right in front of our face. And then the same thing with climate change. I mean, even though it's been kind of getting worse and worse, things like the wildfires and again, really tangible climate disruptions happening. And it kind of all happened in some sense all at once. And so even though we had been talking theoretically that all these sorts of things were hooked together, it suddenly was basically right in our face that all these things were absolutely hooked together.
No, I think you bring up a good point, Jason, that we're kind of at this moment of transformation. Whether that's a good or a bad transformation remains to be seen, but we're kind of faced with, you know, you use the word upheaval kind of across the board. In the United States, we're talking about public health, we're talking about economic fallout, we're talking about systemic racism, which has always existed, but now is much more visible to, you know, the entire population because of, you know, camera phones and all this sort of stuff. And the climate crisis, we're starting to see symptoms of that more obviously. And I think a lot of people can be faced with all of these problems and feel, you know, really overwhelmed and sometimes isolated. So I want to know from your personal perspective, Anne and Jason, when all of these things are happening at once, you're in the work, you're seeing it every day, you know, you're teaching the next generation how to deal with these things. Are you feeling hopeful? Are you feeling discouraged? Are you ready to, you know, retire any day now and get out of this forever? How are you feeling about all this?
Let's see what time it is, and I'll tell you whether I'm feeling hopeful or not. Yeah, I think the idea of the scale of transformation that we're facing is terrifying to a lot of people. You know, it's so many things have to change, and people don't have a clear vision of what kind of changes are necessary. And when people look at the outcomes, whether it's Black people being murdered or wildfires destroying hundreds of homes, or, you know, places going underwater, the despair is huge and hard for it not to like just sink us and make us feel like we want to be in denial because it's too harsh to face it. So I think part of what I've been trying to focus on is the transformation is like there's a before and there's an after. And we've been focusing on the before. Oh, how bad it is. Oh, how awful it is. Oh, how worse it's going to get. But if we focus on the after and what we're trying to create and what the vision is and how much better it could be and how much more positive our lives could be. And that actually is helping people to get out of the despair and out of the sort of frozenness of not being able to act because they're so worried about what they see coming. So that's been really a useful approach, is to look at the vision and look at what do we mean by beloved community? What kind of community are we trying to create here? And what are the steps to move us toward that? And that feels like a more hopeful and productive way to think about it.
Yeah, you know, I think that I mean, one of the whether you're you know kind of an activist working in this or not, one of the things that leads to burnout and despair is looking how far it is from where you are to where you want to be. And I know there's been several times in my career where I've been in a particularly burned out state. But where this came really home to me is, again, it was million years ago, in the height of what I call the sustainability wars at Ithaca College. And I went to a conference and I was just really burned out on everything. And they did an activity where they had us fill out a little thing. And one of the questions was, what would success look like to you? And I realized that my answer was nothing. There was no success that I could write down because I wanted perfect, right? Which of course was why I was completely burned out, was because I couldn't answer that question. So that was part of it, at least my own work in terms of if you have nothing personally that looks like success, then how are you going to keep going? And if success is only the end game, which is going to be, not in our lifetime, then you've already failed because you've created.
Right.
A really great friend of mine at IC, Faye Dreamock, said to me one time, and he said, Jason, our job is not to win, our job is to fight. I thought that, that's going to be my motto from now on, because who knows what winning is going to look like, and it's going to happen while I'm alive. So my job is to fight.
That's really powerful and really brilliant. And for those that are new to this conversation series, the Power Lunch series is part of 1,000 Conversations, which is really a visioning exercise around the Green New Deal that answers that question exactly, Jason, of what does success look like? And our prompt is almost exactly that. If imagine it's 2035, we have achieved the goals of the Green New Deal and created this kind of utopia, whatever that means to you. What does it look like? And I think it is a really challenging prompt to wrestle with, because it's really hard for us to imagine what life could be like outside of our current restrictions, whatever they may be. So I think that's actually a really brilliant first step, is trying to establish what is it that we're really working towards, and really trying to contextualize that in the sense of what does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? Like, what do you hear around you, and how does it make you feel inside? And how do we harness that and get us to the next steps, which I think is a very natural segue, if I do say so myself. What is the next step? Okay, so we have a vision of what we want, whatever that may be, and it doesn't all have to be the same, but probably the folks that are tuning into the series have a somewhat similar vision, at least around climate change and what the future might look like, hopefully. So what happens next? What do? We have this vision, and now what?
Yeah, how do we get at the transformation that we're trying to promote? And I think maybe it's useful to look at some other areas of transformation that have happened in our country and think about, well, what helped make that happen? So I'm thinking about the AIDS crisis, and I'm thinking about the role that nurses played, because the nurses in the hospital were taking care of these gay men, and it was just breaking their hearts to watch one after another die from this disease, and the powers that be weren't doing anything to try to figure out what it was and what was going on and stop it. And the nurses had a huge impact on changing ideas about gay men in our society. And then we moved from there to other issues for LGBTQ people, including gay marriage. And how did that happen? I think it was about relationships. It was about people who knew queer people. It was about people who had gay people in their family. And I think there's a huge role of relationships in making the kind of internal transformation that needs to happen. So I'm wondering, where's the parallel there with the climate crisis? Of course, for LGBTQ issues, the media started to pick it up. It was in television, it was in the media, it was in music, and it just started to blossom out until we got gay marriage, and became sort of normal. Of course, we're facing a huge pushback right now, but I'm just thinking about what's the parallel with the climate crisis, about how relationships can help make the transformation.
And I think there's another aspect to that, which was that the nurses that you're talking about could see the AIDS crisis, right? That they were taking care of the people right in front of them.
Right.
And in many parts of the country, you couldn't see it because you didn't know any LGBTQ people, or if you did, you didn't know that you did, that sort of thing.
Right. Right.
And particularly if you weren't in a city, it was very difficult to see. And so one of the things then that had to happen was it had to become visible. And I think this has been one of the issues with the climate crisis that I've thought about a lot, and is how's it going to hit us, right? Is it going to go along right at the edge of awareness until boom, in which case we seem as people we don't seem to have any ability to deal with stuff like that. But if it comes on you slowly enough that you can see it, then you can do something. And if it comes on too slow, then you forget anything's happening, right?
Right.
And so what it seems to me is that we're in a stage right now where we've finally moved into a rate of change that people can see. And so I think that that's actually one of the most promising developments that I've seen in several decades. And people had nothing to do with that. We just got dang lucky that at this point there's stuff that we can see that at least we hope isn't catastrophic. But I had a wonderful conversation with a fellow a couple of weeks ago. He was a fisherman down on the inlet, and I was chatting with him, and we were just talking about the state of the world and COVID and everything else. And he brought up climate change. He didn't know what my job was. I don't know what his, he didn't know that I work in this area, but he said, I didn't used to believe in that climate change stuff. It just didn't used to make any sense to me. And he said, and then one day I took a drive down to where I grew up as a kid in Ohio, and there was no bugs hitting the windshield. And said, and I can remember when if you drove through those roads, your windshield was covered with bugs. And he says, you know what that is? There is something changing. And I thought that is the key.
That's great.
People can now see it. And this guy who had decided, just in his life that it just didn't make sense, all of a sudden it made sense. So again, I think those stories repeated thousands of times are probably what's going to save us. But then
I'm glad he was talking to you about it, because I think a lot of people don't talk about it. And I think that would help a lot if people just brought it up and talked with each other.
And then I wanted to get back to the other thing you said. So first you have to see it, and then you can't solve it by yourself, right?
Right.
Then it is just despair. So that's then the relationship building has to start, where you find other people who see it, and then you can start making effects that can grow beyond just you or you and your friend or whatever. So really there's those two aspects.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that I wanted to bring up today is I know a lot of people listening to this conversation already know what we've been talking about. And so the question comes up, but what can I do? But where should I start? And, that's what I want to sort of wrestle with, is like just regular folks, not people on Common Council. We know what they can do or not. And not, just regular folk, like how do we move this forward? And if we're talking about relationships, then and we're talking about conversations and bringing it up, if we can get people talking about it more, that's going to help. And so I'm interested in what the two of you think about, like, what are the kinds of things that people can do who already know that there's a problem, who want to make a difference, and who don't have a sense of where to start?
Can I go? I want to go back to an analogy. I think, yes, I know. I did this analogy. I used this analogy in our climate conversations. And maybe it's dorky. I don't know. I'm kind of dorky, but at least to me, it makes a lot of sense. But if you
I
picture,
like dorks. I'm fond of dorks.
picture that we're on a ship and the ship is heading towards an iceberg and it's going to crash into it and sink in like some hours, right? You might say, all right, everybody needs to go and solve the iceberg, the ship crashing into the iceberg problem. But if you then say also on the same ship, a fire has broken out in the engine room, and in a half an hour, the whole ship's going to blow up before it even gets to the iceberg. Then you might say, all right, everybody needs to go and solve that problem. But then if you figure on the same ship, there's pirates have boarded and they're just about to shoot somebody in the next 30 seconds, right? So you have a 30-second problem, you have a half an hour problem, and you have a couple hour problem. Well, everyone has to be solved, right? You don't get to just pick one. And so I think that on the one hand, you could say, well, it's overwhelming to say we got, all these problems piled on us. But that's what it is, right? Whether you like it or not. But I think that the benefit of that analogy is that there's a place for everybody. There's some people that need to go and save the person who's about to get shot by the pirate. Other people need to go and try to put out the engine room fire, and some other people need to go and stop the ship from crashing into the iceberg. And so I think what that does is that, with your resources and your privilege and your personality and the time you have and whatever it is, you might say, well, I don't have the ability to attack the iceberg problem, but right now I can sure save that person from getting shot. And we need all of those working simultaneously. So I know that's kind of just a story and completely abstract. I think that
No, that's great. That's great. But I think it does require a kind of analysis.
And what I would say is that, one, it doesn't matter what you do as long as you do something. I think the problem is saying, I don't know what to do, so I'm not going to do anything. That then means all the problems kill you, right? But if you say, all right, I can only deal with one of these at a time, I only got so much bandwidth, fine, cool, do that one.
Yeah.
And let somebody else
Yeah.
do the other one. Just make sure as you're working on your one that you don't make the other ones worse. And
Uh-huh.
you try to help the ones around you, right? So if you keep in mind that there's other problems at different scales around you, you don't have to be working on them, but you might come up with something for your engine room fire that might actually help the iceberg and the pirate, right?
Yeah. I think that's so true. I remember listening to Angela Davis up at Cornell many, many years ago, and she ended her talk with saying, I don't care what you do, just do something.
Yeah.
And like if everybody did something, big or small, we would start to chip away at it. And I know that some of these things are systemic and we need to work on a collective solution. Like we need to get people together to make sure that Common Council and the mayor do the right thing, or a corporation does the right thing. And so there's a whole, like you said, there's a whole range of individual and collective solutions.
Also, I think that even for a given problem, like let's say you say, all right, we want people's homes to stop producing so much CO2 in the energy production. The solution to that is going to be very different depending on the size of the home, the location of the home, and the income of the residents of the home. So if you have somebody who lives in a relatively large house who's relatively affluent, whatever solution works to make that house, have less carbon emissions for its energy is a different solution than a relatively poor family living in the downtown who can barely pay their property taxes. And so even
Or
though
in a trailer park.
yeah, so you might even with the same problem, there's going to be very different. So, if you say, I'm a social justicer, by God, I'm, and you're helping that poor family, you're also a climate activist, right? And if you say, I'm a climate activist, and you're like, trying to create policy, which is working at the city level, you're also a social justicer, because all those people have to be, brought into the party sooner or later.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to go back really briefly because I think, we jumped around a little bit, but I think, Jason, you mentioned something that I think is really critical to getting people on board with kind of large social change, especially when it comes to, folks that are making policy or people that are kind of on the fence about climate change or any transformation, not necessarily climate. And it's that story, that personal story that got you involved. You mentioned this fisher that, was driving home to Ohio and, remembered seeing bugs hitting his windshield all the time. And now he's not seeing that anymore. And I think that personal story is so critical to engaging with people that, we know the science that's been around, and we've tried communicating the science, until we're blue in the face, and still we're not getting through to people. I used to work very briefly with the National Sunrise Movement on their fundraising campaigns. And the first thing that they taught you was you need to go sit in a room by yourself and think about, what is your climate story? What's your climate narrative? Why are you here? Why is this important to you? And when you call up somebody to ask for a major donation, that's the first thing that you're supposed to share with them is, for example, I was driving and I didn't see any bugs, or, whatever it is. And I think developing that story and really familiarizing yourself with why are you doing this and how do you communicate that with other people is really, really important to building those relationships so that they're not transactional in nature, that they are transformational relationships. So I just wanted
Rebecca,
to plug that in there.
What's your climate story?
Why did I get into this? Well, the climate story that I told to major funders was actually about Ithaca College students and how I actually had a student intern, and we sat down and we were thinking about, I was already working in the climate space. We should bring a speaker in to talk about racism and climate justice. And I told her, I don't want to be another white woman standing in front of a room talking about racism without any learned experience. And she was silent for about a half beat, and she looked me dead in the eyes and she said, we need you to do that. We need white women to be doing this. And every time I think about that, I get emotional, but that's really was the kick in the ass that I needed to really throw my entire self into this work and, bring my entire personality, all of my strengths, all of my weaknesses into this work and really humanize the effort that I'm making towards, a better future. What about you guys? What's your climate story? This is getting so sweet.
What do you got, Anne?
My climate story is animals dying, species going extinct. It just breaks my heart. Yeah, it's about bugs, and it's about amphibians, and it's about turtles, and it's about birds, And it's about mammals, and just watching species after species after species go extinct. It just breaks my heart.
Yeah, I agree, sympathize, and empathize. That's one of my big things too, watching species go extinct. I think where I really, I mean, I am a global change ecologist by training. And I'm not saying that in any special way. I mean, as a scientist, it's very easy to study whatever and to disengage from it at the same time. But I guess where the thing really, where all this came home to me in the most kind of gut feeling way is I was working on at a field site over the course of about 6 years, where we were studying the effects of elevated CO2 in the atmosphere on forest and on soybeans and on lots of different stuff. But in terms of the scientific study, we had a control set of areas, and then we had a set of areas that were being exposed to high CO2 air. And we had to set our instruments for the high CO2 air studies. And every year that I worked on that study, we had to turn the knob up for the high CO2 air, because the treatment was supposed to be, the current conditions plus a certain amount. And the current conditions kept going up, which means that we kept having to turn up the knob.
Yeah.
And just, physically, literally, actually turning up the knob every year for 5 years in a row, that really brought it home in terms of, like I said before, I could see this. I mean, I could watch this, and you could measure it with.
Yeah.
And so that was my moment where I decided, all right, I'm not just studying this stuff anymore. I actually now have to be doing something about this stuff.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I became a professor at Ithaca College, and I started becoming much more applied and kind of in my approach and mixing in, I'm not just going to study this, I'm actually working to try to make the world a better place. A great friend of mine from graduate school, he's like, Jason, what actually do you study these days? So I kind of described it to him, and he said, that doesn't sound like a research agenda. That doesn't sound like research. That sounds like an agenda. And I said, I guess you're right. I take that well. So that was kind of what changed me from just this, I'm just going to sit back and study it, to I'm actually going to work in this area. And that's where I changed from being basically a biologist to environmental studies person.
Right. Right. I remember my daughter Satya talking about working in Costa Rica, where she was studying, she was focused on plant science, and she was studying why the rainforest doesn't regenerate itself once a field is abandoned, why the rainforest doesn't just like move back in the way it does here. If you leave a field, eventually it will go back, it will regenerate. And that doesn't happen in Costa Rica. And they were puzzling about it. And they did solve some of the problems. Like there was one seed that had to go through the digestive tract of a specific monkey before it would germinate. But what she realized at the end of her work there is that all of the science in the world wasn't going to make any difference if she didn't actually interact with the people who lived in and near the forest. And that was a critical element of the change that she hoped to see. And the pure science was not gonna make the transformation that she wanted.
Well, I think this was the huge mistake that kind of the scientific community made starting back in the 80s, was that we scientists, we were absolutely convinced that we would save the world just by getting better information.
Right.
And it was a huge and very depressing wake-up call to us natural scientists that humans just don't work that way.
Right.
Of course, the humanists and the social scientists and everybody else is like, well, duh, of course humans don't work that way. So for everybody, all these other kinds of people, this was no great revelation. But the natural scientists they tried for decades to just solve this problem just with
Yep.
that information. And like you say, Anne, it doesn't work. It's just not how people process information. So luckily, at least like in much of the field has gotten smarter than that, with like what we're talking about here. It's about relationship and personal experience. It's not about making the numbers be better.
Right. I think there's a special case for decision makers, people in municipalities and corporations and other large entities who feel responsible to taxpayers or to shareholders. There's a special case there, and those are often the people who hold the keys to the kingdom and can actually make the kinds of changes that we need to see. And they often feel like they don't want to take a risk. Like it's, even though they acknowledge the urgency, they don't want to take a risk. It feels too big, it feels too extreme, too fast, there's too much money, it's too unnormal, this is not the way we usually do things. And all kinds of resistance rises up to stop the kinds of changes. So that seems like a special area where we need to think about what kinds of tactics help decision makers be willing to take more risks.
I agree. And you see things like that. For example, I'm sure glad I don't have to do this, but say a governor or a mayor filing an evacuation order because of a hurricane. If you don't do it and the hurricane kills a bunch of people, you're in trouble. And if you do it and the hurricane doesn't kill a bunch of people, you might even be in worse trouble, actually. And so I think then as a society also, we have to come to grips with that the person who's making that decision can't be basically, crucified every direction, because then what's going to happen is they're paralyzed, right? And in some sense, if the hurricane comes or the global warming comes, you can always say, well, I didn't cause that global warming, or I didn't cause that hurricane, versus, well, you just screwed up because you personally called an evacuation that didn't need to be called. And so we need to err on the other side. Like you say, we need to err on the other side a bit.
It's hard to build trust with these decision makers, though. It's hard to figure out how to influence them so that they're willing to take more risks, and they're willing to do things that aren't normal and haven't ever been done like this before, and help them build the vision that we've been talking about here, help them trust us enough to take more of a risk. I think that's just a special case we haven't figured out yet.
I think one thing that helps, though, is like what we've been talking about, is if everybody who's not a decision maker is doing something in an area, it creates an environment and an atmosphere where it's a safer for the decision maker to make that decision, because of political will.
Yeah,
that's
a good point.
Right. So we may not be decision makers, or we may actually have decision makers in power that we don't like, but we could still create an atmosphere that pulls that decision in the direction that we want.
Yep.
And I think, for example, that's one of the things that happened with the Ithaca Green New Deal. I mean, I'm talking way outside my area of expertise, but that's a pretty radical thing to do. And those people who passed that took a pretty big political risk. But the thing that allowed that was the environment of the place. Right? Otherwise, it never could have worked.
Especially the young people.
Now, you tell me if you think I'm wrong, but that's what it sure looks like to me. Maybe some
No,
of
I think you're spot on.
say, "Oh, Jason, you're all wrong. It was XYZ." But
No, I think it was the timing was just right, and we had just the right people that were elected at the time, that it almost seemed too easy how it passed. Yeah, we had, the perfect elixir for the Green New Deal here in Ithaca, and I'm very, very grateful for that. But we are out of time, if you can believe it. That went by really, really fast. But I do want to end this on a note of optimism, if possible. We try and do that, or at least a lighter note. So I'm curious for both of you, if you could have folks leave with one thing in mind from this conversation, whether it's, an action step, or if it's something that's really grounding in this movement, what is that one thing that you want people to leave with?
I guess what I would say is, and all I can say is what kind of helps me in, I'm thinking about this polluting chemical or that animal species going extinct or whatever, and what helps is look outside. There's actually birds singing and trees growing, so everything hasn't just gone to shit yet. And as long as that's the case, it's still worth fighting for.
Excellent advice.
I guess I would encourage people to realize that, and Kirby used to say this all the time, the number of things you can control are very small, but the number of things you can influence are very large. And so use your influence. Think about your network. Think about your people. Whatever groups or organizations you're in, whatever relationships you have, think about how to use your influence to tell the story of tell your climate story, offer suggestions, help people do things, whatever it is. But just realizing that it's not about control, it's about influence.
Beautiful. I knew we'd get some sage advice from the two of you. Well, thank you both so much for joining us. And we have some really beautiful discussion happening in the chat I want to acknowledge. So I encourage folks to continue interacting in the chat and sharing your climate stories, and it'll populate on our YouTube channel as well. But thank you, Anne. Thank you, Jason, so much for joining us. I'm so appreciative and so looking forward to continue working together
Yes,
in this
I would love that.
very confusing and difficult space sometimes.
Yep, I would love that.
Thanks
Thanks,
both of you.
Rebecca.
Thanks all the YouTube
Good to
people.
see you, Jason.